Well, that does it for our course on exterior skin coordination. I hope you enjoyed it and that the time spent here pays off in shortening your learning curve and getting you off to a good and efficient start with your next exterior skin coordination program. Good luck to you. Welcome to our presentation on exterior skin coordination. My name is Jason Smith and I'm very excited to present this training. What exterior skin coordination is, how it's differentiated from the work of the design team, why it's necessary, and most importantly, how to go about this process efficiently and effectively can all be very confusing topics. But by the end of this training, you're going to have a good handle on what exterior skin coordination is all about and how to go about the process of executing this crucial project planning effort. A building is comprised of a lot of different products and materials. Every manufactured product is unique, every custom fabricated product is obviously unique, and every single construction project is unique in and of itself. So we obviously aren't going to address all the infinite details that exist throughout the entire construction industry, but through the use of many real-life examples, you're going to gain a solid applied knowledge of exterior skin systems and how they're coordinated. Just a few goals of this course include gaining a clear understanding of what exterior skin coordination is all about and where to begin. You will understand how to organize and lead a thorough and efficient exterior skin coordination program. You'll have the ability to recognize what details do or do not need to be included in the coordination plan, and why. The bulk of this presentation focuses on the nuts and bolts of how to go about the process of coordinating exterior skin details and how to efficiently manage the subcontractors during this process. Exterior skin coordination is a difficult and tedious effort. Every single project is unique and will have its own unique conditions that need to be addressed. We'll go through a myriad of real-life examples, and these examples will provide you with a good foundation of knowledge. You're going to walk away from this presentation with good guidelines to follow when conducting an exterior skin coordination effort, and the knowledge base you need to make good decisions. You will be able to confidently and capably lead the subcontractors efficiently and effectively through your skin coordination program. Now, this course won't provide you with all the answers for every unique condition of your individual project, but it will teach you how to find the problems and how to go about developing intelligent solutions to them. This course has been segregated into 3 parts. We'll begin by defining what exterior skin coordination is and what it is not. In this first part, we'll also lay the foundation for beginning the coordination process. The bulk of this presentation will be in part 2, where we'll discuss the nuts and bolts of skin coordination. In part 2, we will run through a plethora of examples to help you build a solid knowledge base of exterior skin systems. Part 3 will address the management and leadership of this extensive and tedious effort. Competent management and effective leadership are crucial to success. Part 1. Defining the process and getting started. Let me begin by defining what exterior skin coordination is, describing why it is so important, and explaining why it's the general contractor who has to do it. The exterior skin is also termed the building envelope, and it encompasses all exterior surfaces of the building, including the following. All exterior vertical surfaces. Now, this is obvious in what most people think of when the term exterior skin is mentioned, but keep in mind that we're not just talking about the perimeter of a building. Vertical walls within a courtyard or up at the roof penthouse are just as important as the outward-facing walls. Below-grade waterproofing. This is part of the skin as well, even though we don't see it in the finished building. Naturally, the coordination and quality control effort associated with below-grade waterproofing is most important when we have a basement that extends below the water table. All exterior horizontal surfaces, especially the roofing. Plaza decks over interior spaces and balconies are part of the exterior skin also. Roofing in particular appears easy, but there are a lot of things that can go wrong with a roof. And I'll tell you that locating a roof leak is one of the toughest warranty calls a general contractor will ever have to deal with. Anyone who's ever had to deal with finding a roof leak will attest to the importance of a well-constructed roofing system. We'll go through some great examples of skin elements a little later in the presentation when we get to part 2. Exterior skin coordination is not a design effort. It is a trade coordination effort. And trade coordination is the general contractor's responsibility, which is why skin coordination is performed by the contractor as opposed to the architect. That doesn't mean the architect won't be involved. It just means that the general contractor holds the leadership role in this effort. Throughout this process, we do discover design problems and submit RFIs to resolve them, but that's not the primary purpose of exterior skin coordination. Don't get me wrong, it's a spectacular added benefit. It's just not the primary purpose. During the general contractor's submittal reviews, they should be thoroughly reviewing each subcontractor's work, which is great, but it's missing one thing. During the submittal process, we tend to have tunnel vision on each subcontractor's individual and independent scope of work. And that's where exterior skin coordination comes in. Exterior skin coordination is the coordination of systems among the various building envelope subcontractors. Generically said, it's the coordination of the submittals from all of the various building envelope subs, which is one step beyond the basic submittal reviews. Of course, we need to coordinate the work of all subs, which is why we also perform MEP coordination and the like. But in this course, we'll just concentrate on the sub-trades associated with the building skin. We're coordinating details provided by the subs, not the details provided by the design team, although we are using the contract documents for reference, of course. The general contractor is responsible for coordinating the shop drawings, product data, and manufacturer's standard details provided by the subs. And this characteristic is the foundation for exterior skin coordination, and it distinguishes it from both the design work completed by the architect and from the basic individual submittal reviews that we're all accustomed to. The subcontractor's details will be very similar to the design drawings, but usually with much more information. They also won't exactly match the design drawings, and we need to be sure that the various subs' details do not stray from the architect's design intent. There are three primary types of documents that the general contractor is responsible for coordinating. Shop drawings. This is pretty obvious and the bulk of what the coordination effort will involve. Manufacturer-provided details. The quantity of manufacturer-provided details that we utilize on a project is substantial. Many of the building trades do their work based upon standardized details from the manufacturers in the form of simple 8.5 by 11 drawings. Just a small sampling of these trades includes waterproofing, roofing, metal panels, and curtain walls. Sometimes the subs will paste these standardized details into their shop drawings, but nevertheless they are derived from the manufacturers, not drawn from scratch. These details are crucial to a thorough coordination effort. Because product data is simple written literature, it's often overlooked during the exterior skin coordination. It doesn't typically contain details, but it does contain quite a bit of important information. For example, a secondary waterproofing membrane, such as self-adhered sheet membrane or damp proofing, cannot usually be exposed to direct sunlight for more than 30 days. This is because the UV rays dry, crack, and damage the material. What you see in this photo is a self-adhered sheet membrane, which is the black sheet, and also a green secondary membrane that are installed and awaiting the metal panel installation to continue on and cover them up. In the permanent building, they will be fully concealed behind the metal panels, which protects them from the UV exposure. But we need to be concerned with the UV exposure between the time the secondary membranes are applied and when the metal panels are installed. The allowable duration varies among manufacturers, but restricting this duration to 30 days is a pretty common criteria. Again, this won't be found in a detail, it'll be in the product data. Now, you may not know what you're looking for when you start reviewing the product data, but bear in mind that you'll find things as you read through it. The means and methods of construction is a term that describes leeway that the general contractor has to deviate from the architectural details. For instance, an architect is concerned with the final appearance of metal panels, but they're not generally concerned with how the metal panels are supported, as long as they're supported competently. The supports are left to the contractor's means and methods. Another example would be architectural precast panels. The architect is concerned with the final appearance, but the structure of the panels, such as the concrete mix design and the rebar design, are left to the contractor's means and methods. For the most part, the architect is primarily concerned with the form and function of the building. For example, the specific method of supporting metal panels or the specific rebar design in the precast panels do not impact the form or function of the building. That's why the architect feels comfortable deferring those design aspects to the capable hands of the contractor. What I mean by this is that the architect cares that they work. However the contractor makes them work is his own call. The specs will provide a minimum performance criteria for these items, but it's generally pretty vague and only meant to establish a minimum level of quality. The form of a building is what it looks like. For instance, the architect is concerned with the finished appearance of a facade, but they're not generally concerned with the concealed spaces behind each facade system. The function of a building is how it works and is put together. For instance, The architect may specify a premium secondary membrane to be used behind certain facade systems like metal panels that's a self-adhered sheet membrane rather than simple building paper. Self-adhered sheet membranes are more expensive than building paper, and the building paper is commonly used behind metal panels, so what the architect is doing is raising the level of expected quality, which is a better waterproofing system. But the architect won't provide details for the secondary membrane, they'll just say to install it per the manufacturer's standard details. Coordinating the manufacturer's standard details for the secondary membrane with the metal panel supports, wall penetrations, intersections, and corners is the general contractor's responsibility as part of their exterior skin coordination. Details in the contract drawings often utilize certain manufacturers' products, which is termed the basis of design. However, we are not usually required to use that manufacturer's product. Architects need something to base their drawings on, and they can't afford to draw different details for all the different products and product combinations that the contractor might possibly use. This is where the GC comes in with their exterior skin coordination. Let's look at a pretty common and easy example. Curtain wall systems often vary in dimension depending on the specific manufacturer, and these variations might be a ½ inch or more. First, here's how the architect may detail the curtain wall sill. Naturally, a real architectural detail will have a lot more to it than what I've drawn here, but I've simplified this just to get the point across. In this detail, we have an 8-inch deep curtain wall set to align with the face of metal panel on the exterior of the building and the face of gypsum board on the interior side. So the width of the wall has been designed at exactly 8 inches to match the basis of design mullion width. As shown, this looks just fine. But what if our glass sub wants to use a different curtain wall manufacturer than the one the architect used for the basis of design, and this alternative manufacturer uses, let's say, an 8.5-inch deep mullion? This obviously won't match the design intent. So, as part of the general contractor's exterior skin coordination effort, they either need to get permission from the architect to widen the wall to 8.5 inches to match the new mullion depth, or they need to make their glass sub use a different manufacturer who does in fact have an 8-inch mullion that will work. Identifying and coordinating the dissimilarities among the various products intended for use on a project is a crucial function of the exterior skin coordination process. That curtain wall example was just the tip of the iceberg. As another example, metal panel thicknesses might vary by about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. What we have in this photo is an insulated metal panel, which essentially means sheet metal with rigid insulation adhered to the back side of it. The way the architect will incorporate these into the design documents is by using a basis of design product with a certain R value. Regardless of the manufacturer, the specified R value will need to be met or exceeded. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with R values, it's basically a measurement of insulating ability. The R values of insulation differ among manufacturers, so although the design documents may have used, let's say, a 1.5-inch thick panel, the product the sub intends to provide may actually be, say, 1 3/4 inches thick in order to meet that same R value criteria. In cases where it won't impact the interior finishes like our last example did, you will be able to shift the studs back 1/4 inch, and that's a very common solution. As another example, the thickness of a below-grade waterproofing system might vary by 1/2 inch or so. A below-grade waterproofing system generally consists of a membrane material and a drainage mat, which are what you see sandwiched between the building wall and shotcrete shoring in this example. The outside face of building wall is fixed. The design team will have specified exactly where that edge of foundation wall needs to be. So the general contractor needs to verify the thickness of the membrane and drainage mat, then convey that dimension to the shoring subcontractor. The below-grade waterproofing system thickness tells the shoring subcontractor how far back from the foundation wall that their face of shoring needs to be. Remember, the shoring goes in first. If you find out the shoring encroaches too close to the building wall at the time you're beginning rebar installation, as often happens, you're going to be in big trouble. There's no way to push the shoring back, so you're going to have to go hat in hand to the design team asking for a significant structural revision. And that's never fun, usually very costly, and really pretty embarrassing when it happens. For one more example, let's look at roof insulation. Insulation of all sorts is rated in terms of its R value, which is given per inch of insulation. For instance, a rigid insulation board with a value of R5 would require 6 inches of insulation to reach R30. Different insulation products have different insulating abilities, and some wide variations are found in rigid insulation. One product might be an R4, while another is an R7. An R7 product would require only 4 1/4 inches thickness to reach R30, but an R4 product would require 7.5 inches. This is a big difference. As a result of thicker than planned roof insulation, we often encounter elevation problems with roof pads, roof platforms, access door sills, parapet heights, and of course roof hatches as you see in this illustration. Okay, now that we've gotten a flavor of what the exterior skin coordination process entails, let's spend a few minutes talking about how to get off to a good start. Every project engineer I've seen handed the task of exterior skin coordination for the first time began with one simple question: where do I start? That's actually a very, very good question, and the answer is more complex than you might think. Unlike many things in our career and in life in general, exterior skin coordination is really not a very intuitive process. This is why we see so many good and smart project engineers struggling with it their first time. So let's spend a few minutes answering the question, where do I start? Since this is an effort in coordinating the details provided by the various subcontractors, we really can't get rolling until the subs provide their shop drawings, manufacturer's literature, and product data, which obviously means we need their submittals. Now I want to reiterate that we're coordinating the work of the various subcontractors, not the details in the contract drawings. This is a very common source of confusion, so I want to be sure that this key definition is clearly and boldly conveyed. Contract drawings are diagrammatic in nature, which is fine because each individual sub has their own ways of doing things, their own preferred means and methods, and this is exactly why they always provide us with shop drawings, product data, manufacturer's details, etc. That's one of the primary reasons that the submittal process exists. As far as the exterior skin coordination effort is concerned, very little is expected to change during the design team's submittal review and approval process. It's not worth delaying the exterior skin coordination, awaiting what is expected to be just a few minor revisions to the final approved submittals. Also, in many cases, we only have a week or two between the time a submittal is approved and the time the respective fabrication needs to commence. Unless you have a really easy project, exterior skin coordination is going to take a lot longer than a couple weeks, and we need the coordination effort complete before releasing materials for fabrication. Don't wait. As soon as the exterior skin related submittals start rolling in the door, get the exterior skin coordination process rolling. Time is of the essence, because the exterior skin is virtually always on the project's critical path. The first recommended step in this process is to get a clean set of building elevation drawings and identify every unique intersection, change of material, corner, nook, and cranny of the entire building. This is a long and meticulous list. Even though a condition might appear easy, the easy ones often have some sort of a complication associated with them. If it really is determined to be easy, that's fine. It means we'll confirm it's easy with the subs, then close it as an action item without spending more than a few minutes worth of time. No big deal. For example, if you log 20 easy details and just one is randomly found to have a complication, then solving that one random problem makes it worth running quickly through all 19 of the other conditions. The fact is that conditions occurring only once often have more problems than the repetitive conditions. This is mainly because the design teams usually only detail the common conditions and leave the unique conditions up to the general contractor's exterior skin coordination effort. Well, a picture tells 1,000 words, so let's take a look at an example. This is a very basic example I put together to illustrate how to begin planning your coordination effort. I've noted less than a dozen conditions here, but that's just because I'm trying to keep it simple for discussion purposes. In reality, you may have these elevations marked up with 100 different conditions. A large project may have a couple hundred different conditions or more. Let me explain what I've identified here, and hopefully these examples will help you gain a good understanding and a good feel for what to flag in your own coordination effort. Let's start in the top left. CD1 flags where we need to coordinate the expansion joint cover up and over the roof parapet. These are traditionally very difficult details that require coordination of the expansion joint cover, parapet cap, flashing, roofing, parapet framing, backing for the expansion joint cover, and of course the existing building wall. Now the existing building wall may look like the easy part here, but keep in mind that the existing building facades rarely happen to be flat and smooth. So we've got to take into consideration any bump outs, reveals, or other special conditions during our skin coordination effort. With all these factors, CD1 may eventually be broken out into 7 or 8 individual details. CD7 is a flag indicating the head, jamb, and sill of the door frame that needs to be coordinated with the brick facade and the secondary membrane behind the brick facade. I've just noted this as one detail, but you'll actually have 3 different details for the head, jamb, and sill. I would typically log these as CDs 7A, 7B, and 7C. Let's just go over a couple more of these to get the feel for it. At the bottom elevation, you'll see CD2 represents the vertical joint between precast and brick, whereas CD3 represents the horizontal joint. CD4 in the top right appears to be just a cut through the middle of brick, but this is actually a brick ledger angle. Brick needs to be supported intermittently up the face of a building, which is traditionally done with a steel ledger. Now we'll go over an example of one of these in part 2 of this course, but coordinating the face of brick, steel ledger, secondary membrane behind the brick, and flashing that occurs here can actually be very difficult. CD12 in the top right represents a somewhat awkward condition at the storefront. Well, I think that's enough examples on this subject. Hopefully this brief run-through has given you a good feel for the types of conditions that need to be included in the skin coordination effort. And again, I've flagged a dozen or so examples here, but your actual coordination program will easily have 100 or more for a relatively common project, and multiple hundreds for a large project. Okay, now that we've gone through the exercise of flagging and sequentially numbering all of our coordination details, let's talk about how we organize and track them. Use a spreadsheet program to prepare a template for the coordination effort. Create a list of the details you've identified and cross-reference them to the contract drawings. Identify the subcontractors associated with each detail. Add columns to assign responsibility and track the status of each detail. Okay, these are the bullet points, but of course you need a more detailed explanation. So let's move on to an example of how I personally develop and implement exterior skin coordination. This is the template I use for exterior skin coordination. You all develop your own preferred method of organizing and running your own coordination programs, but this example will help you get off to the right start. As you can see, this is a fairly large spreadsheet, but we're really just going to focus on the format and organization of this spreadsheet, so you don't need to read all those little sentences. Okay, let's walk through the column headings. The drawing number and description are pretty self-explanatory, and you'll remember from the elevation drawing that I labeled each detail with a sequential number, which transfers very easily to this column list. The third column identifies whose court the ball is in. Coordinating details means passing a detail from one sub to another. This column tracks who currently has a detail, which is who we're waiting for before taking the next step. This is just like the responsibility column in a set of meeting minutes. The fourth column, action items, is just like the action item you write into meeting minutes. This tracks what the currently responsible person is doing with the detail. I use the comments column to keep track of the history of a detail. Most importantly, what decisions were made and why they were made. Once again, this is very similar to the history in a set of meeting minutes. And also like meeting minutes, I use this next column to track the due dates for each action item. Now, some people will track their details in a much more simplistic spreadsheet, and then they create meeting minutes separately using a word processing program like MS Word. As you can see, I track everything having to do with exterior skin coordination right here in this spreadsheet. It's one single document, very clear and very efficient. This has worked great for me, and I recommend you do the same. These next three columns are where things get a little bit tricky. Now this may sound a bit convoluted, but it's proven to work very well, so let me explain what these are all about. For reference purposes, I always log the contract drawing detail or details for the condition in question. I also use this contract document reference column to track any RFIs, ASIs, or other documents that may have impacted the detail. Anything issued by the design team will be tracked in this column. This next column keeps track of the coordination drawing detail, submittal detail, and anything that is prepared by the general contractor and subcontractors. I found it to be a good practice to keep the design team and contractor-generated details segregated. The current drawing date column is hugely important for exterior skin coordination. Our coordination details may change hands and be altered 5 or 6 times before they're complete. This means there's going to be 5 or 6 different versions of the same detail floating around. Every time a detail changes hands or is altered, it needs to be given a new date. This is absolutely imperative. Ensuring everyone is working with the correct detail is a hugely important management task. Now, I've bolded the detail that governs construction. In many cases, this is a CD or coordinated detail. In other cases, you see I've bolded the submittal detail. This means the submittal detail provided by a certain subcontractor was perfectly acceptable to all subs and no alterations were necessary. If everyone agrees to a submittal detail that's already been created, then there's no need to go through the effort of creating a new coordinated detail. This is a good shortcut that'll save you from wasting efforts generating unnecessary details. In some cases, you see that a contract drawing or RFI might be bolded. This is when the GC and all subs involved have concurred that a detail provided by the design team is sufficient and no alteration is required. Note that this is not the case very often, and it should only be done for very simplistic conditions that are not addressed in any shop drawings. For instance, the intersection between brick and plaster might just be a sealant joint, and we don't need to recreate a detail for that. We can just use a detail in the contract drawings. The next series of columns track approvals of the final details. Note that the architect is included in this list, as is the general contractor. I've always had the subcontractors physically sign a copy of the coordination detail they're approving, which is then kept as a record. Once they sign the detail, I log who signed off and what date they signed off. Logging the date is very important since there are so many in-progress variations of the details that'll be floating around. Keep an eye on those dates. If a sign-off date is earlier than a current detail date, a problem has occurred. That means the detail has been revised since the last time a sub signed off on it. When this happens, we need to get them a copy of the updated detail and get them to sign off on it again. It's a good practice to delete all approval records for a detail when it's revised, because once it's revised, all of those previous approvals are out the window. You're probably wondering, why do we bother logging a coordination detail if we're just going to use a detail from the contract drawings? That's a good question, and the answer has to do with providing good management and leadership. The reason is that we need the entire project team to know that the condition was reviewed and agreed upon. If a condition is not tracked in the coordination drawing log, this omission would make it appear that it was just simply overlooked. The decision to use the contract drawing detail without revision, addition, clarification, or any added information does need to be conveyed to all of the subcontractors. The easiest way to distribute this information to all the various subs is by tracking it as a detail in the coordination drawing log. This way we only need to write it once, and it's distributed right along with all the other coordination drawing information. This is very efficient and effective. Now we're moving into the fun part. Let's start running through some examples of common coordination issues we need to keep an eye out for. These examples will serve two purposes. First, and most obviously, these examples will start filling your heads with good, solid exterior skin coordination knowledge. The second thing I want to get across by way of these details is a good understanding of the types of conditions we need to identify and coordinate amongst the various trades. Exterior skin coordination is a very non-intuitive process, so I've always found that the more examples I can convey when teaching someone how to go about conducting this process, the better they've understood it, the better job they've done, and the more fun they've had doing it. And yeah, I said fun. This can be a lot of fun. Heck, I've always enjoyed it. One last thing I want to point out before we move to our first example is that this presentation focuses on potential problems, and problems are eclectic, not systematic. This course is organized, but I'm going to bounce from one example to the next fairly quickly. Okay, let's get moving into the examples. Let's start our examples at the bottom with below-grade waterproofing and progressively work our way up. I have a couple good below-grade waterproofing examples of things we'll find when reviewing the manufacturer's details. Some waterproofing manufacturers require that penetrations through their membrane be grout packed into the aggregate base in order to stabilize them. This is a good practice that helps prevent the seals around these penetrations from being broken by general foot traffic, especially during hectic concrete pours, where guys are trampling and stomping all around these things. This is unique and not intuitive, so we wouldn't think of it on our own, especially since only a relative few membrane systems require this. But, during the course of simply reviewing the manufacturer's details, we'll find these sorts of special conditions. When we find these sorts of details, we create a coordination drawing number for it, log it, track it, and ensure the MEP subs know they need to do it. Here's a second similar example. When membranes are run between the top of a spread footing and the underside of a column base plate, sealant is used to patch each individual anchor bolt penetration through the waterproofing membrane. The waterproofing subcontractor will seal their membrane to the anchor bolts before the columns are erected. So first, the steel subcontractor obviously needs to be careful not to damage those seals when setting the columns. Secondly, what can very easily happen in these conditions is that laborers will be told to go hand-pack grout underneath the base plates, which is something that they may have done 1,000 times before. They'll do a great job stuffing and packing that grout, but won't realize that while they're doing a great job packing the grout in there, they're also knocking the sealant away from those anchor bolts and probably breaching every one of those seals. In this case, we'll want to make a note on the coordination detail that pourable grout is to be used. A pourable grout will flow gently around the anchor bolts without damaging the seals. Of course, you'll need to get the structural engineer's permission to use pourable grout in lieu of dry packing, but this permission is usually pretty easy to attain. Once again, the point I want to get across here isn't just the specific knowledge gained from these two examples. The point I want to get across is how important it is to review all product data and all manufacturers' provided details. Okay, let's move to another example. For shored excavation, we commonly have to ask two questions. How large are the tieback boots, and do we need additional rebar to accommodate them? The answers to these two questions are routinely very large and yes, respectively. Tieback heads are large, so we need to be sure that the wall rebar doesn't conflict with the waterproofing boot that we place over them. To do this, it's a standard practice to treat the tieback locations just like any other wall penetration, with additional rebar trim bars along the top, bottom, and sides. Temporary shoring is a means and methods of construction, so tiebacks won't be shown on the contract drawings. Many cities and private owners require that tiebacks be detensioned after the building construction has reached the point that the shoring is no longer necessary. This is because tension strands below grade pose a snapping hazard to future digging. If a backhoe hits and snaps a tension strand, we get what amounts to a small explosion that will send dirt and rock flying up into the air. This can seriously injure the laborer standing in the trench who's assisting the backhoe operator. So, to facilitate this later detensioning, we need to construct blockouts around each tieback head as you see in this illustration. The membrane will be lapped past the concrete edges into each of these blockouts all the way to the tieback head. Then, after the tiebacks are detensioned, a waterproofing boot that's shaped something like a top hat will be placed over the tieback head and sealed around all sides of the membrane. When tiebacks need to be detensioned, it requires coordination of the shoring, waterproofing, rebar, formwork, and place and finish subcontractors. Interestingly, this delegation of work should already have been written into the subcontract agreement, but that doesn't mean that the field crews will all clearly understand their particular roles. Think of it this way. You'll never see a crew in the field with a subcontract agreement spread out across their plan table. This is just a reality of construction. That's why it's best to distribute this direction to the field crews in the form of coordination drawings. Don't forget to show the water stop in your coordination details. Water stop isn't always shown on the architectural or structural details, so it's easy to overlook. In case you're not familiar with water stop, I've got a quick illustration here that shows two different types. Regardless of the type, water stop always goes in the middle of a concrete cold joint and is used because cold joints are highly susceptible to leaks. Water stop is secondary to the membrane and doesn't physically attach to the membrane itself. It's essentially just an additional waterproofing measure. Below-grade membranes are designed to be underground and out of sight. So as a result, manufacturers really don't put any consideration into making them look pretty. Although 99.9% of the membrane is out of sight, we do need to run it up 6 inches or so above grade and lap it behind the facade so water properly sheds down over it. As you can see in this photo, a membrane and drainage mat need to be concealed from view at the perimeter base of the building. Be sure to address this with your skin coordination program to ensure the actual products the subs are using do in fact work together to provide a constructible and appealing finished condition. For instance, one problem you might run into is the bottom anchors for the facade system conflicting with the membrane termination bar as you see here. A termination bar might be 1/4 inch thick, which is actually a big obstruction when it comes to situations like this. So let's go through the exercise of examining our options and come to a solution for this one. Those anchors need to be right where they are to support the facade system, so they're not going to move. We can't lower the termination bar because that would be too low and the membrane wouldn't lap far enough up behind the facade for proper waterproofing. So in this particular case, the solution will probably be to raise the termination bar up about 3 to 4 inches to get it up and out of the way of that angle clip. Clearly, we need to have this solution before the below-grade membrane is installed so the waterproofing sub recognizes that they need to run their membrane higher than usual. If we find this problem when the facade sub goes to install these angles and finds that termination bar is in their way, it's going to be too late. That membrane will already be cut where it is and it can't easily be made longer. Now I won't get into the after-the-fact remedial repairs here for 2 reasons. First, I of course hope you catch these sorts of issues before they become actual problems. And secondly, this is a course about preventing problems, not making mistakes and then fixing them later. Before we move into the more exciting primary facade system examples, let's take a minute to discuss some of the more common types of secondary membranes, why we use them, and how they work. It's a standard construction practice to always have dual waterproofing protection with both a primary and secondary barrier. Metal panels, plaster, brick, and other facade types are designed to be fully waterproof systems in and of themselves. But the simple fact of life is that water and moisture vapors just simply find their way past them. Not a lot, but enough moisture that we always need to install secondary membranes behind facade systems to trap any moisture that makes it past the facade, then drain it downward and out of the building. We'll talk about how these membranes collect moisture and usher it out of the building in just a minute, but let's first discuss the various types of secondary membranes. Building paper is one of the most common and also one of the least expensive of the various secondary membranes. We often find it behind plaster, brick, metal panels, and many other facade systems. In this photo you see the prep work for a plaster application, which is building paper installed behind metal lath. Notably, plastic sheeting like Tyvek is generally considered to fall into the same category as building paper. A self-adhered sheet membrane, which is commonly referred to by its initials SASM, is a rubberized sheet with an adhesive backing. This is commonly used to trim out conditions that are at high risk for leaks. This is a very malleable material and is also used for odd twists and turns that building paper is just incapable of making. If you try to make odd twists and turns with building paper, it's very likely to rip, whereas an SASM is much more pliable and durable. Damp proofing is one of the least expensive secondary membranes you'll find. Damp proofing is like a thick, moisture-resistant paint and is usually used in low-risk conditions like over thick concrete walls. The risk of moisture making it through a thick concrete wall that has a fully waterproof facade system in front of it anyway is actually pretty low. So in light of this low risk, a low-cost secondary membrane like damp proofing is commonly used. Air and vapor barriers are commonly found in excessively cold climates. Unlike most secondary membranes that simply focus on keeping moisture out of the building, these actually serve a thermal quality as well by acting as an air barrier. They're pretty expensive, but in freezing conditions, these are necessary to keep the heat in and the cold out. Large and heavy facade systems like precast and GFRC are erected from the exterior of the building, but they're actually connected from the backside of the panels, i.e. the interior of the building. These connections are made by guys standing inside the building, so a secondary membrane sheet hanging in front of them between the panel and the connection point would actually be in the way of these connections. Because a secondary sheet membrane isn't usually feasible in this condition, we might use double sealant joints in order to provide both primary and secondary seals at the joints. Okay, now let's go over the basics of how secondary membranes work. I chose to use a brick ledger angle for this example because it's one of the more complicated facade intersections and serves as a pretty good secondary membrane example. This is a full brick facade with a stud-framed wall, and in this condition we have an exterior-grade gypsum board substrate. Over the gypsum board substrate in this case is an SASM membrane, rather than the less expensive and more common building paper. SASM is often used as a premium secondary membrane. If moisture makes it past the brick, it will be caught by the SASM membrane, which is shown in light blue, which will then use gravity to allow the moisture to drain downward to the flashing, which is shown in green, and the flashing will then route the moisture out of the wall cavity and back out to the face of brick. Now, you're probably wondering how the moisture gets out of the bottom of the brick if the brick is grouted right to the top of the flashing. Well, we use weep holes, like the one you see in this photo. These aren't very noticeable, which is obviously by design. If you haven't intentionally looked for these on a brick facade before, you probably haven't noticed them. Now, each facade system will have its own method of weeping moisture out from the secondary membrane, but even though there are many different methods, the one thing that all facade systems with secondary membranes have in common is that they all have some way of weeping this water out. When we're coordinating the exterior skin of a building, we're not just coordinating the facade materials, we're coordinating the secondary barriers as well. Next, let's go over a couple things that we need to research when we're coordinating a metal panel system. This illustration is a basic diagram of a pretty typical insulated metal panel. In its simplest form, an insulated metal panel is really just an aluminum sheet wrapped around a rigid insulation board. The first thing we want to verify is if the panel thickness of the subcontractor's proposed product matches the thickness of the product used as a basis of design. The dimension from face of panel to the back of system will vary among manufacturers. In the case of this illustration, the back of system is actually defined as the back of the up leg. To keep this example simple, I'm not showing all of the attachments, secondary membrane, studs, gypsum board, etc. I'm just showing the metal panels here. The architect will base the building design on a specific product in a specific dimension, but different manufactured products have different dimensions, so we need to compare the thickness of the proposed system to the thickness of the system the architect used as their basis of design. Before allowing a different thickness, be sure it will work everywhere, including at windowsills and with respect to the interior face wall. For instance, if the exterior wall is a single stud construction and the interior side of the studs is to receive a gypsum board finish, shifting the studs in or out might cause a big dimensional problem on the interior of the building. We also need to verify if the insulation thickness and associated R value match the contract documents. R value is given per inch of insulation, and different manufacturers' products will have different R values. Let's say the architect used a 2-inch insulation product with a value of R5 per inch, which means they're counting on a metal panel system with a total rating of R10. The product provided by the subcontractor must have a minimum rating of R10. If the sub wants to use a lesser quality rigid insulation board that only gives us, say, R4 per inch, it means the insulation will need to be 2.5 inches thick. That's a ½ inch thicker than what is reflected in the contract drawings, and may cause us to revise the stud framing in other dimensions, if in fact revising the stud framing dimensions is even possible. Depending on the unique project-specific conditions, the solution here may be to make the sub provide an insulation product with R5 per inch, even though it may cost a little more than their proposed R4 product. Now, obviously there's a cost impact here, but I'm not going to get into cost responsibility in this course, as that would really be a separate course all on its own. I want to keep this course focused on the pure act of exterior skin coordination. Now, there are two additional things of note worth pointing out on this slide with regard to the metal panel upleg. First, the contract documents will specify the minimum height of an upleg, so be sure the metal panel sub provides a product with a sufficient upleg. You'll quite often find that the uplegs they provide are too short. That's something I've learned through experience, so just keep an eye out for it. Secondly, note how the aluminum sheet is used to make the upleg. This integral upleg negates the need for a separate flashing element. Thus, with this technique, the panels are actually considered to be self-flashing. Let's move to another metal panel example. We must verify that where metal panels meet a curtain wall in the jamb condition, that the panels have sufficient depth for an effective and recessed sealant joint. In this block diagram, we see a metal panel meeting a curtain wall mullion in the jamb condition. For a block diagram, this may look just fine, and there may not appear to be any problem with a casual observation. But let's look at what happens when we add the sealant joint to this detail. There's the problem. When facade components intersect corner to corner, the resultant sealant joint will be large and unattractive. As you can see here, we might end up with a great big, angled, maybe 2-inch wide sealant joint. This example is a clear case of lack of coordination between the metal panel and glass subcontractors. The architect and owner aren't going to like this, nor is this any sort of workmanship that we could be proud of. Let's look at how we should coordinate this detail. By overlapping the facade components, the sealant joint can be recessed to provide a much nicer appearance. And remember, we don't just need enough of an overlap for the sealant. We need enough depth to get that backer rod in there too. There's no set industry standard for this, but a 1-inch overlap is generally considered to be a good construction practice. Now this is an extremely common error and, as I'm sure you've already inferred, is applicable to every facade system interface. Regardless of the material type, or whether the joint is a jamb, sill, head, vertical, horizontal, angled, or upside down. Keep an eye out for these conditions because you're going to come across them frequently. Alright, let's do another one. As part of the skin coordination effort, we need to determine how penetrations will be made through metal panels. This is similar to the lapping issues we just went over in that we need to avoid large surface-applied sealant joints. Just like head, jamb, or sill details, penetrations are intersections of two different subcontractors, so we need to coordinate the work of those two different trades. Again, we need a recessed cavity of about 1 inch in order to get a clean and effective recessed sealant joint. In this case, it would be prudent for the metal panel sub to provide a trim piece on the backside of their panel, as you see in this detail. Also notice that the pipe flange needs to be welded onto the pipe after the pipe is slipped through the hole in the metal panel. That aspect of the condition needs to be coordinated with the plumbing subcontractor early on, because they typically weld all of their pipe flanges in the shop. The laws of physics are clearly going to prohibit that large pipe flange from fitting through that narrow hole. Let's now look at a couple examples related to the caulking and sealant scope. For sealants applied between the work of two different subcontractors, we need to verify which one of the subs provides it. If the two adjacent systems are using different colored sealants, you'll need the architect to identify which side of the joint the sealant should match. In other words, if we have a curtain wall with purple sealant, meaning a metal panel system with orange sealant, what color should the sealant be at the intersection where these two systems meet? In a perfect world, this direction would be found in the contract documents, but the reality is that we rarely find this in the drawings and usually need to ask the architect for a confirmation. Obviously, whichever system the sealant is to match will determine which sub provides it. Be sure sealants are applied ahead of the water repellents. This is another example of what we might learn from product data. Water repellents are a spray or roll-applied product that is often used over porous surfaces like clay brick, exposed concrete, or, as you see in these photos, stone. Water repellents do exactly what their name implies. They repel. So if water repellents are applied prior to completing the sealant joints, the repellent film gets into the joints, and then when we try to apply the sealants, we find that they won't stick. The repellents are repelling the sealant and preventing adhesion. This can be a huge problem, and you'll actually discover it in the product data, not in some detail. Now let's move on and do some glass and glazing examples. For this example, let's examine how a curtain wall over an architectural precast panel is supported. At first glance, this might seem like an easy answer. Just set it on the precast. Precast is big, thick concrete, so why not? Unfortunately, it's not that easy. Precast systems are routinely designed by the design-build precast subcontractor to support their own weight and nothing else. And we have two options for this condition. We could increase the structural capacity of the precast to support the curtain wall load. This will probably also mean adding embeds in the top of the precast panels for attachment of the curtain wall. Or, we could provide a steel ledger angle to bridge between the building structure and the sill mullion. Because precast engineers are usually very apprehensive about having another sub's work bear atop their panels, this steel angle is the route most often taken. Now, some of you are probably thinking, shouldn't that angle be in the contract documents? And the answer is, it depends who you ask. General contractors commonly believe that a secondary steel element such as this should be shown in the contract documents. On the contrary, architects commonly believe that a secondary steel element like this is part of the curtain wall subcontractor's design-build system, thus it is a means and methods of construction, so they don't think it needs to be in the contract documents. Since it's the architects who are developing the contract documents, they typically do it their way and they don't always show these types of supports. Clearly, there is a big financial aspect to this, but I'm going to stick to the activity of exterior skin coordination here and leave the financial discussions for my scope of work video series. Otherwise, we're going to get sidetracked for hours. Coordination of connections is a tremendously important aspect of the exterior skin coordination, especially for large and heavy skin components like precast, GFRC, and curtain walls. You do not want to find out that you have a conflict between structural components in the field during construction. When we find these problems during construction, it can bring the work to a halt, and in many cases one of the two subs will need to modify their work. If these modifications are a result of the general contractor's lack of coordination, the general contractor could end up paying the bill for it. For this example, let's expand on the previous illustration with the assumption that the glass subcontractor is going to provide a steel angle support for their curtain wall. In this scenario, we actually have two conflicts, so let me start with the first one. Note that this angle is designed to be continuous, not intermittent. Okay, now let's add the precast support. Uh-oh, there's our conflict. The precast support is running right through the curtain wall support angle. As a solution, in lieu of long continuous angles, the glass subcontractor will probably need to install their support angles in short sections between each precast support, and leave gaps between the angles wide enough for the precast sub to access their final connections on the back sides of the panels. Our second problem here is a sequencing issue. If the precast subcontractor were to perform all of their work ahead of the glass and glazing subcontractor performing any work, the precast panels would block access for the glass sub to install their steel angles. On the contrary, if the glass sub were to install their curtain wall before any precast work was performed, the curtain wall mullion would cross over and cover those gaps between the support angles. And remember, the precast sub needs those gaps to access their connections. So, we need to logically sequence the work of these two trades. In order to sequence this work properly, each sub is going to need to make two mobilizations to install their work. First, the the precast subcontractor will install their connections to the steel beams. Next, the glass sub will install their ledger angle, and this ledger angle has been modified to occur in segments between the precast connections as opposed to continuous. The precast sub will then erect their panels, and after the precast panels are in place, the glass subcontractor can come back and erect their curtain wall. Okay, let's do an example using window films. It's always best to apply window films in the shop as opposed to in the field. It's much easier to install the film in the horizontal position on a table in the shop than in the vertical position after the glass panes have been installed. This is just one benefit here. But an even more important benefit with relation to exterior skin coordination is that we want the edges of the window film to tuck into the mullions. The window film depicted in this illustration was installed after the windows were complete, so its trimmed edges are exposed. Odds are the trimming won't be perfect and will have some exposed glass around the edges. Equally importantly is that the exposed film edges are going to be prone to peeling. We can solve these quality control problems by burying the film edges into the mullions so the edges are both concealed and protected. In order to accomplish this, the films need to be applied before the glass is installed in the mullions. Here's a photo of an actual glass installation at a pretty basic window mullion. This is a behind-the-scenes shot of what the inside of a mullion really looks like. We'll next talk about secondary steel. Let me start by clarifying the difference between primary and secondary steel. Primary steel is defined as the steel structure of a building, i.e. the columns and beams, and is provided by the structural steel subcontractor. Basically, if removing a piece of steel would cause the building to fall down, that's a piece of primary steel. Secondary steel is all the rest of the steel in the building, including stairs, bollards, and steel used to support building components such as precast and other heavy facade materials. Generally, although there are some exceptions, the miscellaneous metal subcontractor will provide the secondary steel on a design-build basis, which means they will also engineer the steel to ensure it is sufficiently sized to carry the intended loads. For instance, the contract drawings might call for an HSS member spanning between two primary steel columns for support of a precast panel. The architect will just show an HSS member, then the miscellaneous metal subcontractor will determine the size and thickness of the member and also design the connections. We must verify there is secondary steel everywhere the precast and other subs need it. This is a big one. The heavier the facade material, the bigger of an issue that this is. Most heavy facade systems, like precast and GFRC, are completed on a design-build basis, but the secondary steel that supports these systems is actually provided by the miscellaneous metal subcontractor. Because the miscellaneous metals and various facade subcontractors are performing their work in a design-build manner, it means the general contractor has got to coordinate it. We have to verify the secondary steel provided by the miscellaneous metal sub matches the needs of the various facade subcontractors. Using precast as the example, think of it this way. For every precast panel connection, which are usually at the four corners of each panel, they need something to attach to. In some cases, the primary steel will happen to be there, so we'll use that. However, where we have a precast connection and no primary steel right behind it, that's where we need secondary steel. Be sure the base plates for secondary steel are concealed within the walls. This is one of my pet peeves. In general, design teams, subcontractors, general contractors, and everyone else in our industry seem to concentrate on the head, jamb, and sill details, but everyone seems to forget about the corners. Conditions such as this protruding base plate are the result of this oversight. In cases such as this, we have two options. We can either use an oblong base plate that is fully concealed within the wall cavity, or we can bury the base plate beneath the top of slab deep enough to cover the top of the anchor bolts. If you choose the latter, be sure to coordinate the thickened slab section with the rebar, formwork, and place and finish subcontractors. Okay, this next one's on architectural precast. We need to be sure the connections, pick points, and other structural components remain concealed. For a steel building structure, precast panels are erected from the exterior with a crane, and the connections are made on the back side. Those connections are rarely a problem. However, when we erect precast panels over the face of a concrete shear wall, we don't have any physical access to the back of the panels, and that can be problematic when it comes to both erecting and anchoring the panels. In this first illustration, you see an exposed connection at the end of a precast wainscot. In this particular case, the owner allowed the contractor to leave the panels as installed and just paint the steel clip, but this was only allowed because the problem didn't occur in a very prominent location. Had this been in a prominent location, the contractor probably would have had to tear out the panel and replace it with a panel that has some sort of a concealed connection. Although this was allowed, the owner and architect were quite disappointed, and the general contractor was extremely embarrassed by it. This could have been avoided if it was addressed with the exterior skin coordination program. What you see in the second photo is the top of a precast wainscot panel that's about 3 feet above grade. Maneuvering precast panels around the shop, onto the trucks, and eventually into position on the building is not easy. So precast subs commonly add pick points at the tops of panels, and in this photo you see where a pick point has been patched. Having one of these patches every 4 feet or so around the building is not attractive. This is a photo from the same project as the first photo, and the owner was not pleased, nor was the architect. Because this problem was not discovered until the panels had all been fabricated and the first batch showed up on site for installation, the owner did not demand the tremendous expense of redesigning and refabricating all the panels. Again, the general contractor was pretty embarrassed by this, especially when they had to tuck tail and beg the owner for leniency. Site concrete isn't an exterior skin material per se, but we do need to address its intersection with the building as part of the exterior skin coordination process. As a good rule of thumb, always bring a fluid material to a solid material. This is a key rule of thumb for constructability and for coordinating the intersections of the various exterior skin components. So let me explain what I mean by this. In this example, we have a precast concrete wainscot at the base of a building, and it's surrounded by a sloping concrete sidewalk. Here's a section cut diagram. In this condition, the wainscot should bury about 3 or 4 inches below the top of sidewalk. By doing this, the sidewalk will slope along the face of precast panels straightly, cleanly, and consistently. Taking into account construction tolerances and the fact that the wainscot will be fabricated in the shop, if the sidewalk were to run below the wainscot, it would inevitably result in an uneven gap from the bottom of precast to the top of sidewalk. This general rule is applicable for just about any fluid to solid system interfaces, including facade interfaces involving plaster. This same principle would apply at, say, a plaster soffit or wall where it meets precast, metal panels, or any other solid product. We want the solid products to go in first, and the fluid products second in order to take advantage of what I'll call the innate flexibility of fluid products. Now let's go through some expansion joint cover examples. Expansion joint covers are commonly manufactured for use in straight, flat, uninterrupted lengths. However, building facades aren't straight and flat. Heck, if they were, they'd be boring. In the secondary steel example, I pointed out how we need to break ourselves of the tendency to focus on head, jamb, and sill details, and force ourselves to review corner conditions as well. We fall into the same trap with expansion joint covers. With expansion joint covers, we tend to focus on the section cuts of straight sections, but the straight sections aren't where we run into the problems. When designing the expansion joint covers, don't just look at the standard sections along the straight lengths. Be sure to examine each corner, angle, intersection, or other change in direction. As you can see from this photo, we wanted to use a flat aluminum expansion joint cover product for this project. But although that product, which you see at the underside of the soffit, looks great in the straight portion, that flat product was problematic at the twists and turns as we rounded the brick corner, headed up the brick, and up and over the top. We had to use a much less attractive and utilitarian product for those twists and turns. You should have an exterior skin coordination detail for each and every change in direction that an expansion joint cover makes. Now that's a lot of details for these seemingly simple items, but I speak from experience when I tell you that expansion joint covers are not nearly as simple as they appear. Something else that's worth noting here, one side of an expansion joint is often an existing building facade, and most existing facades are not flat and straight, which means that they're going to require prep work. Because we tend to just concentrate on the new building at hand, prep work to existing buildings is often overlooked. Obstructions on existing buildings like brick bump outs, stone corbels, sills, etc. all need to be trimmed to accommodate the expansion joint covers. Don't forget the existing side of an expansion joint cover during your exterior skin coordination effort. One last piece of advice before we move on to the next slide. Be sure to closely coordinate how the expansion joint covers wrap up, over, and down the parapet. With the vertical wall expansion joint cover, roofing system, existing building facade, parapet cap, and roof level expansion joint cover all meeting in the same spot, you're going to get some pretty congested and difficult details. Wrapping the parapet is often found to be one of the more difficult exterior skin coordination conditions, so be sure to pay special attention to it. Next, we'll discuss one of the most critical waterproofing types, elevated deck waterproofing. Coordinating laps between the vertical and horizontal membranes is crucial. Deck waterproofing typically needs to be run up a vertical wall about 6 inches above the finished surface. The finished surface in this case is the top of topping slab, not the top of the membrane that you see below the topping slab. As a good reference, the curb you see here is 6 inches high, so the deck membrane needs to lap up to the top of that curb. And then the secondary membrane behind the brick laps down, typically about 6 inches, over the deck membrane in order to shed moisture. In this illustration, the typical construction sequence of installation would be to install the deck membrane, then install the secondary membrane on the wall, then install the brick facade, and finally the topping slab. The problem with this sequence of construction is that it subjects the deck membrane to two types of damage. First, it can be damaged from UV light. Most underslab membrane manufacturers prohibit their products from being exposed to direct sunlight for more than 30 days. Now this duration varies among manufacturers, but 30 days is pretty common. The reason is that the UV rays from the sun will dry and crack the membrane. So, since the facade and topping slab construction will undoubtedly take more than 30 days, we've got a problem with this sequence of construction. Secondly, exterior decks are always found to be good places for staging materials, setting up sawhorses, and any other type of construction traffic you can think of. These construction activities, materials, traffic, etc., will undoubtedly damage the membrane. To prevent this construction damage from occurring, we can follow a slightly different route. As shown in this illustration, we can initially install the deck membrane from a point about 12 inches from the face of brick to up behind the brick, and then postpone the remainder of the deck membrane until after the brick facade is complete and immediately prior to placing the topping slab. This way it's only exposed for a shorter and more manageable time frame. The skin coordination program does not just need to be a stack of details, it should also address sequencing issues like this. Okay, next on the list is a roofing example. Avoiding pitch pockets whenever possible is an excellent construction practice. These things are a pet peeve of many contractors, owners, architects, and especially building maintenance supervisors, and I discourage their use on each and every project that I'm involved with. Roof jacks are designed to wrap round or nearly round objects. About the furthest you can stray from round and still use a roof jack is typically tube steel. A pitch pocket is commonly used when we have something penetrating a roof membrane that a roof jack won't cleanly wrap, such as a bundle of conduits, bundle of pipes, wide flange steel member, or a steel angle like you see in this illustration. Pitch pockets have been around for decades and they're very often used. Unfortunately, they're also very common sources of leaks. The fluid-applied pitch material dries and cracks due to its exposure to the direct UV rays, and this is a widely accepted trait of pitch material, but it also means that pitch pockets typically need to be maintained on an annual basis. A problem lies in that building maintenance workers in reality don't think about these little roof penetrations during the normal course of their duties, and the result is that pitch pockets often go unmaintained for years until they crack to a point that leaks are occurring. The use of pitch pockets is declining rapidly in popularity, and I recommend everyone get on that train. It's a good idea for you to avoid them whenever possible. Use steel pipe and tube steel shapes in lieu of angles, wide flange shapes, C-channels, unistrut, or other steel members for which a roof jack cannot attain a proper seal. Conduits and pipes should penetrate the roof individually, not in groupings. We'll actually talk about MEP penetrations a little bit later in this course. Don't forget to include the little guys. 90% or more of the coordinated details might come from just 3 or 4 of the major subcontractors, but we can't forget the other 10% or so of the guys who still have an impact to the building envelope. Although some subs may only have one coordination detail associated with their scope of work, we still need that detail. Let's look at an example concerning louvers. Louver manufacturers typically provide sill flashings when requested, but the problem is that they don't typically provide custom sill flashings. The flashings they provide are off-the-shelf standard products such as what you see in red in this illustration. Now, in a basic condition like you see here, where the face of louver aligns with the face of wall, that's no problem. The manufacturer's standard sill flashing will work just fine. However, for a different wall configuration, such as what you see in the second illustration, that standard sill flashing doesn't work. It's in conflict with the building wall. So in conditions that don't match the louver manufacturer's standard products, we typically need a custom flashing, and since louver manufacturers don't do custom flashings, it will most likely be furnished and installed by the flashing sub as opposed to the louver sub. Even the doors, frames, and hardware subcontractor needs to be included in the exterior skin coordination program. One problem I see quite often is a door sub providing thresholds that are too narrow. As you can see in this photo, the threshold stops short of the slab on grade, so we have exposed gray concrete right in front of the door. We could use a wider threshold that covers the gray concrete, but these wide silver thresholds can actually be eyesores in and of themselves. We could also notch the slab on grade so the colored site concrete infills all the way to the threshold. This is the more costly, but also the more attractive solution. The MEP subs aren't little guys, but because they have very little to do with the exterior skin of a building, they are considered little guys in this regard. These guys don't typically provide exterior skin systems, but they do penetrate the building envelope with their ductwork, conduits, and piping. So let's look at a few examples. We'll start with the duct penetration through an exterior wall. Your skin coordination program should have 3 separate details for this: the top, bottom, and sides of the duct. Now the mechanical sub typically does all of their own flashings, which is great because we always want responsibility for a penetration to be held by a single company. Duct penetrations are one of the more difficult waterproofing penetrations, so there's a few things I'd like to point out here. First, the head flashing in this condition will land atop the duct. It won't have a down leg. You'll want the mechanical sub to use 2 or 3 rows of sealant joining the out leg of the flashing with the top of the duct. Don't just rely on one bead. Also, you'll want the up leg of this flashing to lap up behind the secondary membrane behind the facade material. So, we need to be sure that flashing goes in ahead of the facade, which is well ahead of when that duct is going to be placed. Otherwise, that up leg will be surface mounted, which is both unattractive and an inferior waterproofing method. It's also a good construction practice to slope the duct slightly away from the building. This helps shed water away from the building and ensures we won't end up with water ponding atop the duct and up against the building. Let's talk about roof jacks for a moment. First, they typically need to be spaced 12 inches apart. The dimensions for this spacing may vary among manufacturers and roofing types, but a minimum 12-inch separation is pretty standard. This is so the horizontal flange of the roof jack gets a proper, clear, and flat transition with the roofing membrane. Of course, this 12-inch separation isn't just required between conduit or pipe penetrations. We also need a 12-inch separation from parapet walls, equipment pads, and any other vertical item that you find on a roof. In this photo, you can see the contractor really did a great job coordinating the conduit penetrations through the roof. It obviously would have been a lot easier for the electrician to just bunch all these conduits together and pour a bunch of pitch around them, rather than having to construct that big rack. But to ensure a good roofing detail, they didn't take the easy route, they took the correct route. Next, we'll look at a coordination issue involving the below-grade waterproofing and plumbing subcontractors. Penetrations through below-grade membranes are similar to roof penetrations in that they typically need to be spaced 12 inches apart. This rough illustration shows a steel sleeve through a concrete foundation wall with a copper pipe running through the middle of the sleeve. The steel sleeves are traditionally furnished and installed by the plumbing subcontractor, and that pipe sleeve serves as a delineation of work between these two subcontractors. The exterior side of the basement wall has a waterproofing membrane with a drainage mat, and the below-grade waterproofing subcontractor should be held responsible for sealing their membrane to the outside of the steel pipe sleeve. However, the plumbing sub should be responsible for sealing between their pipe and the inside of the steel pipe sleeve. They do this with an off-the-shelf product called a Link Seal. This next example involves the shoring and electrical subcontractors. Keeping below-grade penetrations 12 inches apart can be especially difficult when we're bringing an electrical duct bank into the building below grade, which, as you can see here, is a large group of electrical conduits for the electrical service. Shoring piles are typically spaced about 8 feet on center, and one way or another it always seems that a soldier pile ends up being right smack in the middle of where we need to bring a duct bank into the building. Now, duct banks commonly need to enter directly into the back of the electrical gear, and the electrical gear position in the building is usually pretty well set in stone due to constricted electrical room layouts. So, that means that we can't just simply shift the duct bank to avoid the pile. We have to move the pile to avoid the duct bank. As you see in the illustration on the right, shifting one soldier pile will likely result in the addition of another pile in order to maintain the minimum spacing. Once soldier piles are installed, they can't be moved, so this needs to be addressed during the shoring design phase, which usually begins about an hour after a notice to proceed with construction is issued. At this point in the project, we're usually dealing with getting trailers hauled out to the site and putting fences up. Exterior skin coordination isn't typically on our minds this early. And this is exactly why this particular problem is routinely overlooked and isn't discovered until the electrician is out there digging for his duct bank and says, "Hey, who put this shoring pile in my way?" Shoring is a temporary structure, typically done by the design-build contractor, and is considered a means and methods of construction, so it's the general contractor's responsibility to coordinate the work with the other trades. Now, the vast majority of exterior skin coordination work won't even begin until facade submittals start rolling in, but be sure to coordinate the below-grade waterproofing system immediately after the notice to proceed is issued and in conjunction with the shoring, rebar, formwork, and concrete submittals. And don't forget the little things like Knox boxes. Knox boxes are key lock boxes for use by the fire department in the event of an emergency. As you can see from this photo, when we forget about the Knox boxes, they end up being surface applied late in construction and they become blemishes to the building. And because Knox boxes are for life safety, they're always placed in prominent locations, such as the main entrance to a building. Now that you understand the process, let's talk for a minute about how to lead the subcontractors through an exterior skin coordination effort. For many project engineers, the exterior skin coordination is the first time that they take on a true leadership role with the subcontractors. In this third and final segment of the course, we'll go through the step-by-step fundamentals of efficiently and effectively organizing and leading the subcontractors. Let's talk about what we need to do prior to our kickoff meeting with the subcontractors. It's very important to do your homework to ensure you're knowledgeable about the building. You've got to be ready. The better prepared you are, the more respect the subcontractors will have for you. And the more respect the subs have for you, the easier your leadership job is going to be. First and foremost, review the submittals. Early in this course, I mentioned that the time to start your full-blown exterior skin coordination effort is when the submittals start coming in. Once you have the initial submittals from the major subs in hand, it's time to get rolling. But before gathering all the subs together, you must have reviewed and become familiar with their shop drawings, product data, etc. Now, you don't have to have all the answers yet, but you do at a bare minimum need to be familiar with their drawings and details. If you don't take the time for this review, you're going to look dumb in front of the subs at the first meeting, and your first impression is not going to be a good one. Like the old saying goes, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. Thoroughly review the contract drawings. You're the leader, so you have to be familiar with what the team is trying to accomplish and what this building's supposed to look like. Read the specifications. You must read all of the facade-related specifications and identify special or unique conditions. Now, specs are really boring and none of us like reading them, but they're nonetheless very important. Get a head start on identifying the coordination details on a clean set of building elevation drawings. We discussed this when I brought up the marked up photo of the building elevation. Be sure your numbered drawing is ready for the first meeting, because that drawing lays the foundation for the exterior skin coordination process. Create a coordination drawing log and itemize all the details you flagged on the building elevation drawings. For this first meeting, the log needs to be ready, but at this point, all you truly need is the coordination detail number, detail description, and contract drawing reference columns filled out. Remember, you're going to use this spreadsheet to compile your meeting minutes, notes, and action plans, all of which begin development during your very first coordination meeting. So you'll need the spreadsheet drafted and ready to go for the first meeting in order to get off to a running start. Now, if you follow this advice, you're going to walk into your first coordination meeting knowledgeable and confident, both of which are keys to great leadership. The first meeting will lay the foundation for the coordination effort. This first meeting is a kickoff meeting, so it doesn't need to be a long one. You want to get all of the various facade subs together, lay out the game plan, and don't get into too many details. The reason you don't want to get into too many details is because during the detail conversations, only 2 or maybe 3 subs are involved in the conversation at a time, which wastes the time of the rest of the group. We'll talk about this some more on the next slide, so please just hold on to that thought for a moment. At this first meeting, you'll want to make the introductions and exchange contact information. Just go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves, and this should really only take about 5 minutes or so. Distribute the initial coordination drawing log and numbered building elevation drawings. This is a big deal during the first coordination meeting. Give everyone a copy of these documents and spend about 5 to 10 minutes explaining how you've put the program together and how it's going to work. Tell the subs that they need to be prepared to discuss their details at their next meeting, and really emphasize the importance of being prepared and ready to make decisions at their next meeting. Individually ask each subcontractor what coordination issues they've discovered during their shop drawing preparation. Call them out. Now, it's great if subs come prepared to this first meeting, but in reality you're going to find that most of them don't, and that's where we come in. We've got to lead them. Really emphasize that they all have action items before coming to their next meeting, and that's to review the coordination drawing log and to identify details that they feel need to be added to it. A few days after the first meeting, it's a great idea to send an email out to the whole group reminding them to review the coordination drawing log and, most importantly, identify details that need to be added to it. Otherwise, the odds are some of them are just going to forget, and others of them will just flat out procrastinate. Don't forget to bring the donuts. Now this might sound ridiculous, but you'll be amazed at how much goodwill a couple dozen donuts will buy. All in all, you might make it out of this initial coordination meeting in about 30 to 45 minutes, but the rest of them won't be anywhere near this quick. Okay, now let's talk about why that first meeting was so short. It's got to do with good time management. Use good time management when conducting the weekly coordination meetings. During the weekly meetings, you'll start banging out coordination details one by one until they're all done. And some details will actually be discussed at 5 or 6 meetings in a row until they're finally resolved. The entire group doesn't need to attend every meeting. For the first meeting, we do need to have all the different subs together to build the team and lay out the game plan. But in the regular coordination meetings that follow, we'll have a very narrow focus on individual details of specific trades, so there may only be 2 or 3 different subcontractors at each individual coordination meeting. Prepare agendas for each meeting that consolidate the issues of 2 to 4 different subcontractors and only request that small group attend the meeting. During a coordination meeting, you may have time to go over about 20 details. So for one meeting, you might focus only on intersections involving, say, metal panels, glass, and plaster. Then only require those 3 specific subcontractors to attend. Now you'll have occasions when larger groups and even the entire group needs to attend the meeting. As you get closer to the end of the coordination process, you'll find the groups getting larger and larger, and the time spent on each individual detail getting shorter and shorter. Put together a coordination schedule and distribute meeting agendas at least a few days ahead of each meeting. We don't want the subcontractors showing up to meetings wondering what we're going to cover. We want them to know what we're covering well ahead of time so that they know what to be prepared for. This is crucial. If a sub comes to a meeting and responds, "I'll look into it," repeatedly, it means they aren't prepared. They must have looked into it prior to the meeting, otherwise they're wasting everyone else's time. These procrastinators are going to be one of your toughest leadership challenges. Weekly meetings are for decisions, not discussions. Exterior skin coordination meetings are working meetings. We don't want to sit around a table identifying problems. We need to sit around the table solving problems. Well, that does it for our course on exterior skin coordination. I hope you enjoyed it and that the time spent here pays off in shortening your learning curve and getting you off to a good and efficient start with your next exterior skin coordination program. Good luck to you.